right, so I want to go back and here I have like a three column layout. Okay, and I'm even just going to make the column gap really small. It doesn't even have to be. Let's make the column gap something more reasonable, like 25 or something. So something like this, right? And I'm on a desktop right now, and it actually looks, the design looks pretty good, right? Because, there's a lot of available width space here. So having a three column kind of makes sense. I don't think you would really want it as a one column. And the reason why is when things are very wide, this is a type of, they've done studies on this. It's very hard for people to read really long dimensions, right? The reason why is if you have to literally tilt your head, it just makes it harder for people to read. There's actually a sort of character count that's considered sort of the optimal character count. So if we have a two column layout here or a three column, that might be a little bit better. The columns don't become too wide, It doesn't feel like the design is just, sometimes it just feels like we should really be dividing this content up, right? So let's just say for the sake of argument, you decide, or you and your client, or you and your team decide you want a three column layout. Now that looks pretty good, right? But as we get kind of smaller, like it's still three columns, but this design isn't quite working the same amount. This might be better as like a two column. And especially as we get really, really thin like that, like this is, it is technically three columns, but I don't think this is a good design at all. It just doesn't look optically very good, right? Even though it's still three columns. So what we might want to do is have a design where, you can have a certain number of columns, but as the width gets smaller, the content, if there's not enough, if the content gets too tight, it can go to the next line. Okay, you know what I mean? Kind of wrap, if you will. And that's what we're going to kind of do today, or in this particular video. So I'm going to go to exercise 11. And let's take a look at that. So what we're going to do is for a very wide browser, we can have like say four columns or three columns, but as the browser gets smaller, we're going to have less columns and the content is going to wrap. So you can see like this just wraps to the next line automatically. Okay. So how can we do that with what we know about grids? So let's, once again, it's all about the setup of your HTML. So let's just double check, understand everything before we start applying too much. All right, so I have this container and it has direct children. Each direct child has some text about a particular state. I've already set it to a grid, and each child right now has a little border around it so you can see the individual children. So each one of these is like, this is going to be the table cell essentially. All right, what I'm going to do is let's use our old friend grid template columns. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to use repeat. Okay, you have to use repeat to get this to work. And we're going to use a something called autofill. So normally this would be how many columns you have. So if I put two here, that would be two columns. If I put three, it would be three columns, four columns, so on and so on. What this is basically saying is, okay, we don't have a specific number of columns, but what we're saying is fill in the available space with as many columns as you can. Now, to figure that out, it's like, well, okay, we have X amount of space here. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, this is 1,000. Okay. How do I know how many columns I could set, right? Well, the answer is if you know what the width is, let's just say this is 1,000. and you know how wide you want each column to be. Let's just say for the sake of argument, this is 300. This is not exactly to scale, so I don't know if this is going to work, but then if I'm saying, okay, just fill in the available space, it's like, well, okay, I should be able to get 1, 2, and then 3, right? I'm sure you love me spending time playing around Figma. All right. So it's like, I have 300, I can put in 3. There's still 100 pixels left, but it's like that's not enough for one of these. So if I were to actually have a 4th table cell, it would be, it would have to then wrap to the next layer or next line, I should say, so on and so on. Okay. Let's just say for the sake of argument, this changes from 1,000 to 700. All right, well, the problem is this last one, there's not enough space for 900, so this one's going to have to now move here, and then everything follows suit, okay? So what is happening here is this is saying, okay, this is actually why we have to use the repeat function, because it has to repeat. We don't know how many columns there's going to be. And we have to give it a width. So let's say, okay, I want my columns to be 300 pixels for right now, or actually I think I say 400 in this case. So I want each one of these children to be 400. Fill in as many columns wide as you can. And if there's not enough space, just go to the next line. So if I save and we go back, you can see that currently I have 4 columns for my really wide page here. But then as this gets smaller, so what happened here is, do out the math. If each one is 400 and I have 4 of them, the width of my page was probably about, this would be 1,600 pixels. So my browser's probably at like, I don't know, 1,700. And then when I get smaller, let's say now it's at 1,500. Well, that's not enough space for all 4. So this one then goes to the next line, and I kind of have this kind of empty space here. And then now we're probably at about 1,300. When I get below 1,200, because there's 3 of them and each one is 400, it goes to the next line, and then available space, and then goes to the next line. So what we're getting here is kind of this nice little responsive columns where my content's kind of just being distributed equally. So why this could be really useful is, this kind of design would work really well for a desktop. And then for something like a smartphone, which is typically a lot thinner, something like that, or this would be better. All right. Now, you might have noticed that it does fill in, but like sometimes there's this available space here. And so I'm kind of wasting space. It would be kind of nice if I only have 3 columns, that the columns kind of take over this available space and kind of equally distribute it. So kind of the 3 columns go to the all the way to the edge, you know what I mean? So there is actually a way of doing that. Let's go to designers. And so this is similar to what we just did. It's just like one extra little step. So it's going to look like this, where it's going to be 3 columns. Okay. All right. So let's just, once again, let's just kind of look at everything. I have a parent with a bunch of children. These are direct children. Fashion designers in this particular case. And I'm going to preview this. Oops. And what I'm going to do is let's do kind of like what we did last time. So grid template columns. And if you remember, we have to use the repeat for this particular thing to work. If you're not changing the number of columns, then you don't need to do this. This is only if you want to use this kind of method where it like adds or subtracts columns based on the width. And let me use autofill. And let's set it to like similar before where there's like 400 pixels. Okay. This says, repeat how many. Autofill means as much, put as many as you can, depending on the amount of space. This is the width of each of the children. And, I get something similar to what happened in the last one, but I'm getting this. Okay. So I have this available space. So what can we do? I don't want to get too deep into this because it involves something called a CSS function. But what we could do is do something called min-max. What min-max does is it's a function in CSS that will figure out what the minimum value of something is and you can set a minimum value of something, you can set a maximum value of something. Okay, hence the word min-max. Okay. We talked about sort of like max width. It's kind of like that. So what we're going to do is say 400 pixels and then 1 FR. Okay. Make sure the parentheses, it's just like in PEMDAS and math, you got to make sure the parentheses all fit. Now this seems really confusing. So let me just kind of go over what happens here. Okay. We're setting up a grid and then we're saying is, okay, fill in the space with as many columns as you can. That's what autofill means. Okay. What this is this is saying this is the minimum space that your column can be, and this is the maximum. So what this is saying is like, okay, if there's more than 400, make this an FR, and the FR will take into account the available space. Remember, fractions take up any available space and divide it up. In this case, because they're all going to be 1 FR, they're all going to get the same amount of space because it's an equal division. And so it can't be smaller than this, but it can't be bigger than this. So if there's let's just say you had 3 columns, the minimum, this is the same as me saying, well, this would be the same as me saying 300, 300, 300 as the minimum, or sorry, 400, 400, 400 as the minimum. Or this, if there's enough space, this is the same as me saying this. Okay, which means that it can take in the available space, divide it evenly. The result of that means you're going to get this. Now you might be saying, well, why didn't we just do that here? Why didn't I just say autofill 1 fraction? And the problem is that it needs a minimum width. Okay, if there's no minimum width, it doesn't know what the minimum of the column should be. And that's why we need it in something that's an actual finite value. Okay. Otherwise, it's like it does, if I had, it might take this and decide it needs 5 columns or 10 columns, but that's not really what I want. I want my columns to have a minimum specific width. And that's why we had to do it this way. Okay. I know it can be a little confusing if, about what we just did here. I save and preview. There you go. So you'll notice this makes a nice, really responsive layout here. Okay. This is something that a couple years ago would have been really difficult to do. And now it's literally kind of 1 line of code. Okay. So try that out. When you guys get to your final project, you might want to think about utilizing something like this so that your designs can kind of work between different devices, and it will sort of add or subtract columns depending on what you need. Okay.